Chapter 2, Training Days. Attention! As Henry stood up straight, holding his rifle against his shoulder and staring straight ahead, the sergeant said, "By the left, quick march!" Henry thought to himself, how long are we going to be doing drill, I wonder? I am starving. Just as he thought this, the sergeant said, "Platoon, halt!" As the 42nd Battalion gathered into parade formation, standing in straight rows in columns 6 wide on the Lanark grounds, Henry found himself standing beside Jimmy Trail, his best friend. The sergeant then said, "Men, you may be wondering why we've been training so hard. Well, what you may not know is that we may be going to war. In Europe, there are things happening that cause us to believe that we may have to go and support England. This is what you've been training for, and I know you will bring honor and glory to our regiment. Think about it. Attention! Dismiss." After Henry and Jimmy grabbed their roast beef sandwiches made with homemade bread and butter with some lettuce, they headed down the steep bank of the Canadian Mississippi River to eat their lunches under the bridge. Dressed in their khaki drill uniforms and cap, they made a striking appearance. It was easy to see why there was always a group of 30-40 people who would stand on the back slope by the general store when the 42nd Regiment would train. As Henry walked with his best friend Jimmy said, "What do you think of that announcement, Henry?" "I don't know. I never thought about going to England. I don't particularly have anything against the Germans." "I know, but can you imagine what an adventure it would be?" Henry replied, "It would be quite the adventure. I think it would be unlike anything I will ever do again, and it would be nice to get away from the farm for a bit." Jimmy said, "Well, I know I'm going. It is why I signed up for the regiment in the first place. Day after day, milking the cows, chopping wood, feeding the chickens, fetching the water, and that's all I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Eventually I'll get married and show my kids the same thing as well. It would be nice to have a story about how their old man charged against the battlefield, staring the enemy down and chasing them back to where they came from. And then also being able to tell them what England looks like. My mom and pa don't even know what England looks like. And to sail on a boat, to see the ocean, to ride a train. When am I ever going to do that again? And to be able to come back and have everyone know just how brave and strong I am. I would be a hero. I am definitely signing up." As Henry listened to Jimmy, he couldn't help but think how right he was. Henry had been thinking for a while it would be nice to get away from the farm, to have a real adventure like a Sir Walter Scott or Robert Louis Stevenson story. To see the England described by Charles Dickens would be the highlight of his life. But then as he looked at his best friend, Jimmy, all 5'4" of him, smiling at him, he thought about the guys from Perth who had died in the Boer War. Henry couldn't help but think that Jimmy was still just a boy. He said, "Well, if you're going, I better go. Somebody needs to have your back." "Well, it's settled then. I wondered what the rest of the guys are going to do." As Henry and Jimmy walked back up the bank to the grounds, Henry thought about Archie Sinclair, Roy McIntyre, and the other guys, and wondered how many of them would survive this war. So in chapter 2, we start to get the background on what the men that signed up for World War One, what they thought it was going to be like. It's important to recognize that up until that point, all the wars that happened before it, when you talk about the War of 1812, you're talking about the Spanish-American War, you're talking about the Boer War, they were all very similar styles in that everyone would line up in a line, they would have their muskets or their rifles, and they would stand there and basically shoot at each other. World War One was really the first time that we saw a war where there was machines involved, where you had machine guns and cannons that were used on the battlefield, hand grenades, or as they would call them, Mills bombs. And so the destruction that happened in World War I was unlike anything we had ever seen before. And it was something that the men at that time did not appreciate. And so it's also why we begin to hear about things involving PTSD, not known at that time. It was simply called shell shock. But we started to see some of the trauma that becomes associated with war during this time. And so when you think about what these guys were going to, they the description of what their lives have been like were basically they were looking for an adventure. They were looking for something different that they would be able to refer back to and show how they had one great wonderful thing that they had done in their life. They also believed that the war was going to be short, that they were not it was not going to be years, it was going to be months, and that they would do their part and then they would come back. And so you begin to see that as Henry and Jimmy move through this adventure, it really isn't like we thought it would be. And that the requirements that they had were much, much greater than we could ever expect. We will look at chapter 3 starting tomorrow.